My name is Jutta Renee. I'm the Dean of the Faculty of Law, and it is a real pleasure to welcome you all. Those of you here in the room, it's great to see so many of you here, and also a good number of people online. And in that context, also welcome to many of our alumni here today. I would ask, first of all, that we take a moment to pause and reflect on some of the history that has brought us to this point and how we might individually and altogether contribute to moving forward on the path of reconciliation. This land on which the University of Toronto operates has for thousands of years been the gathering place for many Indigenous peoples across Turtle Island. It has been stewarded as a site of learning, exchange, teaching, and sharing. This has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, the Seneca, and I also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island, and we at the law school are grateful to have this opportunity to learn and work and to build community in a good way together on this land. I would also now like to acknowledge the gift that supports today's Morris A. Gross Memorial Lecture. The lecture series was established in the memory of the late Morris A. Gross by the law firm Minden Gross LLP and by members of his family, friends, and professional associates. The intention of the lecture is every 2 years to bring to the Faculty of Law a distinguished scholar or a member of the practicing bar or bench for discussion with the student body and the faculty. And since the creation of the Asper Center for Constitutional Rights, the Asper Center has been responsible for organizing the event and has stewarded the tradition of inviting distinguished guests, including past Chief Justices of Ontario, Attorneys General, and leading practitioners. And I couldn't be more delighted to welcome tonight the Honorable Michael Tulloch, Chief Justice of Ontario. And I very much look forward to his lecture on the topic of building public trust and confidence in policing, needless to say, a pivotal issue that has been a priority for him, as no doubt we will hear for some time. So we're so pleased to have you with us here today. And I will now turn things over to Cheryl Milne, the director of the Asper Center, to more formally introduce our distinguished guest speaker. Cheryl.
Thank you, Dean Brene. Chief Justice Tulloch was born in Jamaica. He's a graduate of York University and Osgoode Hall Law School. He has received honorary Doctor of Laws degrees from the Toronto Metropolitan University, the University of Guelph, and the Law Society of Ontario, as well as an honorary Doctor of Divinity degree from Tyndale University and Seminary. He was admitted to the Bar of Ontario in 1991, serving as a Crown Attorney, then a criminal defense lawyer. He was first appointed to the bench in 2003 as a judge of the Superior Court of Ontario. And in 2012, he was elevated to the Court of Appeal for Ontario. And we were delighted to learn in early December that he had been named Chief Justice of Ontario and President of the Court of Appeal. We, of course, got our invitation in before that. And so we were quite fortuitous that he kept his obligation, his commitment. His commitment to the profession, legal education, and education more generally is evident from his past work. Chief Justice Tulloch served as a member of the Ontario Superior Court Education Committee, the National Judicial Institute, and the Commissioner's Judicial Advisory Committee on International Engagement. He was a distinguished fellow at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy here at the University of Toronto, and a distinguished research fellow in the Center of Law and Policy at Toronto Metropolitan University. He was a founding member and a patron of the Second Chance Scholarship Foundation, chair of the advisory board to the Black Business and Professional Association, and a former president of the Canadian Association of Black Lawyers. In 2016, Chief Justice Tulloch was appointed by the Ontario government to conduct important reviews, which resulted in 2 extensive reports: the 2017 report of the Independent Police Oversight Review and the 2018 report of the Independent Street Checks Review. Some of the report's key recommendations have yet to be adopted. However, the recommendations he made in his police oversight review, including making the public process more accessible, have inspired the Asper Center's Police Accountability Project, funded by the Law Foundation of Ontario. It was his work on policing that inspired the Asper Centre to invite him to give us this year's lecture when he was still a lowly Justice of the Ontario Court of Appeal. As I mentioned, or as not as I mentioned, but Professor, as was mentioned in the materials actually, Professor Kent Roach, who serves as an advisor to our student working groups on this issue, and who was recently authored Canadian Policing, Why and How It Must Change, was intended to give this introduction. And he passes on his regrets for not being able to be here. And he has also passed on to me the following words. There is no more qualified person than Chief Justice Michael Tulloch to address what is needed to build trust and confidence in the Canadian police. His 2 reports on street checks and police review are important landmarks. They lay out with precision and passion a route for a better future in Ontario and beyond. He has proposed that regulations on street stops ban all forms of discrimination and the development of much needed codes of practice to inform the police and the community. His report on police review seeks to add coherence and continuous learning to Ontario's complex system of reviews that both the rule of law is applied to police conduct, but that police learn so that deaths and serious injuries are avoided in the future. He has recognized the positive role that complaints, education, and inquests can make to improve policing and build greater trust and confidence in our police. And on that note, I invite Chief Justice Tulloch to present his lecture, Building Public Trust and Confidence in Policing.
Thank you so much, Cheryl, for that very kind and warm introduction. Also, I want to thank you, Dean Renee, for facilitating and inviting me to be here this afternoon. And certainly to Professor Kent Roach, who, in my mind, is one of the leading, not only intellectual voices, but inspirational leaders in the issues of not just policing, but an entire spectrum of criminal law. So it's certainly an honor to be invited here, and you're absolutely right. I was invited a long time ago, and I certainly welcomed that invitation, and very much looked forward to coming. I want to acknowledge some of my good friends here. I was here earlier with Professor Jim Phillips' class, and Professor Phillips and I go way back from when I was a student at York, and was on the Osgoode Society of Legal History. He's now the editor-in-chief of that society, and I was privileged to sit in on his history class this afternoon. And I was so impressed at how incredibly smart and insightful your students are. Another friend of mine sitting right beside him is Justice Michael Code. And Michael knows me from when I was a young Crown Attorney, and he was the Deputy Attorney General, or Assistant Deputy Attorney General for Ontario. And a lot of the things, or the work that I did, policy work that I did, including being on the Martin Committee review response team, creating the charge screening system for the province of Ontario was done under your leadership, Michael. And I thank you for the opportunities that you saw in me back 30 years ago. And it's certainly an honor to have you in this audience this afternoon. One of my friends here who only see each other in the locker room at the YMCA. And anyway, it's quite amazing. I walked in and here his wife came up to me, and I totally forgot that you were one of the partners at Minden Gross. So anyway, thanks to Minden Gross for being a sponsor of this incredible lecture series. there's so many, my colleague, Justice Kathy Feldman. It's great to see you. Thank you for being here. And all my law clerks who are just incredible. You're here in the audience. We thank you for coming, including, okay, so one of my other law clerks from like years ago, Mishak Butili. 5 years ago, Mishak. It's good to see you. And there's so many great people in this audience, one of which is also a fellow Jamaican and an incredible Jamaican. His father was interestingly enough, right? My cousin was one of the prime ministers of Jamaica, and his father was on the other side of the political spectrum. But one of the greatest leaders of the Caribbean in those years, Mr. Howard Shearer, who, by the way, he speaks incredible Japanese, right? I mean, if you listen to this guy speak, you think that he's Japanese until you look around and see that he's actually a black man, right? But he can speak Jamaican, he can speak Japanese the same way he can speak Jamaican, by the way. Mr. Howard Shearer, who's the chairman of Hitachi Canada. So Howard, it's great to see you here. And certainly last but not least, I want to thank both the Minden Gross firm and the family and friends of the late Morris A. Gross, who established this lecture series, as well as the David Asper Center for Constitutional Rights for convening this lecture. I was doing my perusal of the former speakers, and it's quite amazing to see the luminaries from the legal profession who have been speakers here in the past years, and they include people like Marlos Edworth, the Honorable Lynn Smith, the Honorable Irwin Kotler, as well as my predecessor and friend, the Honorable George Straffy, Chief Justice of Ontario. I want to take this time to commend the Asper Center for the work you do in contributing to the building of public trust through the enhancement of police accountability. Now, as you're aware, in 2018, I was appointed by the Ontario government to conduct independent reviews of police oversight, as well as the government's regulating street checks. Throughout the process of these reviews, I gained a renewed appreciation for the role and functioning of policing within our society, as well as the critical importance the public trust and accountability plays in enhancing the profession of policing and ensuring its relevance in an increasingly complex and pluralistic world. As I address the topic of policing and the issues of building public trust and confidence in police, it would be remiss of me not to mention that in spite of the headlines and the news media, we do live in one of the safest countries in the world. And we have some of the best police services and police officers in the world. Police officers in Ontario, both municipal services as well as the provincial police service, have a consistently high level of public support from most communities. There's always, however, room for improvement. It is important to begin with an acknowledgement that policing is a noble profession. Each and every day, police officers don their uniforms and risk their lives to serve and protect our communities. Some have paid the ultimate sacrifice during the course of their duties. In just the past 4 months alone, from mid-September to December 2022, 5 police officers have lost their lives during the course of their duties. And they're Constable Andrew Hung, 48 years old, Constable Travis Gillespie, 38 years old, Constable Devin Northrop, 33, Constable Morgan Russell, 54, and Constable Greg Pierce Charlotte, 28. And, These are young men who have paid the ultimate price during the course of their duties. And we as a society owe them and their families a great deal of gratitude. All of these fallen officers who were heroes entered the profession of policing with a desire to contribute to the public good and to serve and protect their communities. I'm sure none of them anticipated or desired to put themselves in harm's way or the situation which ultimately led to their deaths. Each time harm comes to a police officer, we as a community are negatively affected by such harm. And so we collectively grieve with the fallen officers and his or her family. We as Canadians live in one of the safest countries in the world precisely because of our collective adherence to the rule of law and our reliance on a professional police service to both enforce the law and to protect our communities. While policing as a profession in Canada benefits from a high degree of support and trust from the communities that they serve, there are still significant challenges when it comes to policing in many economically challenged as well as racially and ethnically diverse communities, including many First Nation communities. These challenges are often exacerbated by a perception of over-policing in these communities, which often result in a disproportionate amount of negative police-community relations. This perception, unless addressed, has the effect of eroding public trust and confidence in policing as a whole. Therefore, we all have a vested interest to ensure that public trust is maintained and negative public sentiments towards policing is minimized, if not eliminated. Public trust is the bedrock on which police legitimacy is built. Without it, police lose authority and the ability to do their jobs. Today's talk is particularly timely, given that institutions, governments, as well as professions are grappling with complex issues and questions when it comes to public trust. The policing profession is not immune from these concerns, which have been further amplified with the advent of the internet, technology and social media, as well as the ubiquitous cell phone cameras. In fact, the proliferation of social media platforms such as Instagram and TikTok, with the proliferation of these particular platforms, everyone now has an opinion about everything. And everyone has an opinion about everyone else and about every profession. And not only do they have a view of the world as they see it, in their own minds, they are all experts in their own right, regardless of their educational foundation or preparation. And they also have an unfettered and unfiltered mode of broadcasting their views and self-professed expertise. While there's no doubt that technology and the internet, coupled with artificial intelligence or AI, has led to significant progress in all aspects of our society and is here to stay, there are also some downsides. The proliferation of the internet has seen an advent and rise of new types of crime. We now have the dark web, where individuals are able to hide behind their screens and engage in all sorts of criminal behavior, including but not limited to fraud, child pornography and exploitation, human trafficking, various types of hate crime and criminal harassment, as well as crimes directed at public officials, such as politicians, educators, as well as members of the judiciary. We also have increased incidents of random violence on our urban streets. And this does not go without notice for me. I mean, over the last week, there's been all sorts of incidences of kids swarming adults, people being stabbed on the subway. And, you know, the randomness of these types of crimes are very much alarming. And a lot of these are people attacking strangers. There's been packs of teenagers and young people who have been implicated in some of these attacks. And not to mention increased incidents of domestic and partner assault through violence. A lot of these have been triggered or have come to light during the COVID or the pandemic period. Many of these incidents are triggered by mental health issues and an increased incident of social unrest with our society, coupled with a desensitization to acts of violence, which in many cases is correlated to an increase in certain types of video games. I was talking to a young man the other day, and he was telling me about all these video games that, you know, you just go on there and you kill people. And they play these games, and we as a society don't quite understand and or appreciate the psychological impact that these have on desensitizing the minds of young people towards acts of violence. There's social media websites, as well as a public appetite for a 24-hour news cycle that focus on reporting acts of violence. So to a large extent, this is the context in which most police officers are expected to operate and function in 2023. A large part of the core function of policing is their oath to serve and to protect the communities within which they work. Their effectiveness in this role is directly dependent on their ability to garner the trust and respect of the public at large and the communities in which they work. So when I was tasked to conduct the 2 independent reviews of policing in 2017 and 2018, I quickly concluded the root cause of the problem that gave rise to the discord within certain marginalized and racialized communities and the police was a lack of trust in the police within these communities. So it is my hope that by outlining my approach and providing the historical context and the current social context, that, you know, it will become evident to you some of the lessons which I've learned during the course of those reviews, how they can inform us moving forward, and how we can, through some lessons learned, address some of the emergent issues to rebuild and to continue to build public trust and confidence in policing as we move forward as a society. You know, public trust is built through mutual respect and honest communication. As I will discuss further later on in today's lecture, it is built by finding common ground, even when there is misunderstanding. Police and the public have a symbiotic relationship. Healthy police community interactions inevitably lead to positive police community relationships. And without positive police community relationships, the police cannot effectively serve its communities, which in turn will erode the public's trust. So for example, if a crime occurs within a particular community, without relationships between the police and the community, then the police will have difficulty solving the crime. To effectively solve the crime, the police invariably depend on the cooperation of the community. Similarly, from the community's perspective, while it is certainly in their best interest to cooperate with the police, If there is a broken relationship, then they will have very limited or little incentive to cooperate, even when they themselves are victims of crime. So they will rather act against their best interest than to cooperate if that relationship of trust is broken or eroded. Therefore, to be effective, police need to have the public's confidence and trust. Greater trust leads to greater legitimacy, greater community engagement, and ultimately greater public safety. When I speak about the importance of public trust and confidence in policing, I certainly did not come up with the idea myself. Rather, I'm invoking the 9 principles of modern policing, which were first established by Sir Robert Peel. One of those principles includes the recognition that police officers are merely citizens in uniform, although they're citizens that their society has viewed to be of such exemplary character that they can be trusted to have special powers which are unavailable to other citizens or to other professions. The special authority bestowed on the police is at the behest of the public and is to be exercised in the public interest. This is generally referred to as policing by consent. Policing by consent recognizes that the exercise of these special powers by the police depends on public approval. Public acceptance of the police's role in society is legitimate, is based on public trust, and requires the respect and cooperation of the public. At times, this trust can be eroded if there are not sufficient safeguards in place that provide a level of accountability and transparency within the policing profession. The relationship between the police and the communities they serve is undoubtedly complex. It is a relationship that must be situated within its historical context in our modern pluralistic society. Now, for some communities, particularly the Black and Indigenous communities, historical realities have led to fear and distrust of the police. The stories continue to be passed down generation by generation, and the legacies of mistreatment at the hands of the police can still be felt today. For example, while conducting my review on civilian oversight, police oversight bodies, I heard stories about the killing of hundreds, perhaps even thousands of Quimit or Inuit sled dogs at the hands of the RCMP officers at nights during the 1950s in an effort to remove the Inuit population from their habitats in the north and to integrate them with the mainstream population in the south. The loss of Quimit deeply affected the Inuit culture. It deeply affected the health of their people and the well-being of them. And this not only affected them, but it had an intragenerational trauma. And it's quite interesting because I remember sitting down in Ottawa in some of these meetings with Inuit people. And, you know, this was in 2018. And I could feel the pain, like they were literally crying and were sobbing like babies. And these were old, you know, people in their 60s and 70s whose parents experienced these kinds of historical experiences. So it's not surprising then that decades later, it continues to be a flashpoint for Inuit memories. The changes imposed on them by outsiders, including police. As indicated, I could feel the pain in their stories, and they told them to me. Members of the Black communities also recount a long history of discrimination, oppression, and marginalization the effects of which resonate to this day. And there are examples, and one of them is in the 1970s, tensions came to a head when Albert Johnson was shot by the Metro Toronto Police in his own home and died shortly after internal bleeding. His death was precipitated by months of him feeling scrutinized and besieged by the police. Now, he had mental health issues, but Johnson had filed complaint after complaint to the Ontario Human Rights Commission. But at that time, his claims were simply perceived as evidence of his mental instability. Following his death, Johnson's widow leveraged community engagement and the legal system to challenge the deadly actions of the police. Thousands of protesters flooded the streets, demanding greater transparency and accountability in the system. Now, that was I would say historically, one of the most significant events in the history of police in Ontario that triggered the Public Complaints Commission, the creation of the Public Complaints Commission, as well as later on, back in 1999, some years later, the creation of Special Investigations Unit, the SIU. Now, police training, especially on how to address situations involving people with mental illnesses, has evolved and improved since then. And such issues have been largely addressed. But the culmination of stories about individuals from marginalized communities being arrested, charged, and sometimes killed by police officers year after year, in combination with events that happen also in the US. And unfortunately for us, we, because of the mass media, we're sometimes confused for the situations that occurs in the United States, right? And as I stated right at the outset, it's a very different reality down there, but what happens, there still impacts our perceptions. And to some degree, the experiences of people within our own communities. So it is in the context of this historical backdrop that I conducted the 2 independent reviews. In 2016, after the SIU cleared police of any criminal wrongdoing in the death of Andrew Loku, a 45-year-old Black man with mental health issues who was fatally shot in his home, protest ensued once again. Public, especially Black communities and groups such as Black Lives Matter, made it clear that they still lacked trust in the police and police oversight. People demanded change. In response, the Ontario government asked me to review the civilian police oversight bodies in Ontario. Then again, in 2017, I was appointed by the Ontario government to lead an independent review of Regulation 5816 and its implementation. And what this regulation was it's a regulation that was introduced in 2016, which outlined new rules for the collection of identifying information by police in certain circumstances, a practice that is commonly known as street checks and sometimes referred to as carding. And as you can well imagine, me going into this, both of these reviews, the backdrop was very polarized, very heated, and almost politicized type environment. During my 2 reviews, I learned many lessons. And just before I get into the lessons, when we started, nobody wanted to talk to me. They didn't even want to meet with me because they didn't have any trust in the system. And what they thought was that, okay, you're a judge, it doesn't matter that you're a Black judge, who cares, right? You represent the system. And you're a part of our oppression. And that was the antagonism that I saw when I first started, especially the very first review. And, you know, I thought about how are we going to do this? And I thought the best way to do is to just have a conversation. Let people talk and to speak about their pain, their hurt. And, you know, I validated their feelings, whether or not I agreed with it or not, just by listening to them. And after a while, they realized that, yeah, okay, he's here to actually pay attention to us. And by so doing, I started to have a trust relationship with my audience. And I didn't only do this with the affected communities or the stakeholders that were aggrieved with the police. But on the other hand, right, like, I mean, there was also this tension also within the police and stakeholders. They saw me as this Black guy, and I'm going to be siding with the communities that are protesting. Didn't matter that I was a judge, right? Like, and I can tell you that that's the way I felt in a lot of them. But I approached it from the exact same perspective. I said, okay, let's talk. Let's have a conversation. And I can assure you that I will listen. But let's have a dialogue where we're going to engage, and we will engage honestly about whatever the pain and your grievances are, right? A lot of these people that are protesting, they don't understand what your job is and or what your role is. And, you know, there's historical issues here that informs their actions. And ultimately, I was able to get people talking to me. And once that happened, as time progresses, I was able to get them to talk to each other and listen. And ultimately, we had at the end of the entire process, we had a very collaborative, solution-based process. So we ended up with 129 recommendations. And I can tell you that all of those recommendations, most of which were adopted by the government, were arrived at through a very collaborative, open and honest process, right? And because of that, it started to build trust between the aggrieved communities, including the Indigenous communities, as well as the Black communities and the police. So these are the lessons that I learned, if I can just summarize them. So, and I think that they inform me on a go-forward basis in almost any issue, any kind of situation that I am tasked with, right? And these lessons can be summarized in three main headings. First, when tensions are high among groups, it is crucial to find the common ground that unites them, right? Second, education and communication are prerequisites to solving conflicts. Lack of education and lack of communication exacerbates conflicts. And third, to most people, a fair process, right? Due process, fairness is important. And that's all they really want. They want to know that there's a process that is open, transparent, and fair. These lessons or ideas are probably not new to most of you. However, in relating to you, how they apply to my work and my reviews, I hope that I can stress to you how very important they are. So the first, common ground. Traditionally, Canadians have enjoyed a relatively good relationship with the police, as I've stated earlier. No other country has a police officer as a national symbol. The image of a uniformed member of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police is iconic, a representation of Canada, as is the maple leaf. In Canada, the close relationship between the police and the public began at Confederation. And while Americans in their Declaration of Independence recognized life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness as being inalienable rights, Canadians were content to ensure that they enjoyed peace, order, and good government in their Constitutional Act of 1867. That principle is reflected in the view the police are the public and the public are the police. That is the ideal, but it doesn't always feel that way. It certainly didn't feel that way at the time of my appointment to conduct the review in civilian police oversight bodies in 2016. Tensions were high between communities and the police, communities and the police oversight bodies, and between the police and the police oversight bodies themselves. Much of that tension related to the perceived legitimacy of the police powers. Those powers cover the spectrum from a mere brief detention to giving mandatory orders up to the use of force, including lethal force. Those powers must be shown to have been exercised properly and legitimately. When society or a segment of society begins to believe that police powers are not being exercised legitimately, there's an erosion of confidence. Such a perception of illegitimacy can arise if police services are not seen to be transparent and reflective of the communities they serve, or if the exercise of police powers targets some communities more than others. This erosion, if left unchecked, can lead to a crisis of public confidence. Many studies in the United States and the United Kingdom have shown that when there is a perception that police powers are not being exercised legitimately, people will be less likely to call the police when help is needed. Instead, they may turn to self-help or street justice. And from my research and observations, this sentiment also holds true in various communities here in Canada. Policing as a profession is one of the arms of the administration of justice. And those of us who work within the system need to bear in mind that the integrity of the system is entirely dependent on others and how others perceived us. In order to ensure adherence to the rule of law, we need to have buy-in from the public about the relevance of the rule of law to their everyday lives. Without that, people may be less likely to assist in a police investigation when a crime occurs. As a result, it is imperative that the police operate in society with the cooperation of the public and in a manner that is and is seen to be legitimate. And it is important that people feel they're heard when members of the police force are not fulfilling their duties. I've been commencing my review and meeting with police and concerned members of the public. I needed to find common ground between them. Common ground comes with having an open mind to stakeholders, with a wide variety of different perspectives, including those who may be at odds with each other or at odds with what you represent. As indicated, I was aware that as a judge, I represented an authoritative figure who was coming into their space. At times, this was a difficult engagement, but that made it all the more necessary. Finding common ground means that you cannot approach the conversations from the perspective of preaching, but rather an attitude of understanding, respect, and empathy. Only then can you foster an environment that is conducive to an open and honest conversation. As such, despite the tensions that existed at the time that I began my independent reviews. I was pleased to see that we could find such common ground between police and members of the public. For example, all agreed that there needed to be greater transparency and accountability. The public wanted more reporting from the SIU, and so did the police. All agreed the delay in the oversight process had great negative consequences. Nobody benefits from investigations being dragged out over months and years. And all agreed that there needed to be greater independence to the police misconduct complaint process. In the end, these areas of common ground served as some of the main planks of my report on civilian police oversight bodies. Those being the following: transparency and accountability, efficiency, and independence. From my perspective, finding that common ground, I believe, is crucial towards building broad support among police and the communities they serve. Second is education and communication. The next thing I will touch upon is the importance of education and communication. And when I speak of education, I'm not necessarily speaking of education in the formal sense. Rather, I mean education in the broader sense, is in the process of taking the time to study and learn and understand an issue or someone else's point of view. When I speak of communication within this context, I mean taking the time to discuss and have an open dialogue so that there is real transparency, which leads to mutual understanding. In the context of policing, issues with education and communication manifest themselves in many ways. Today, I want to focus on 3 of these issues and explain how education and communication can alleviate them. The first and second are in the context of civilian oversight bodies. And they're 1, the release of reports, and 2, the release of names. The third is in relation to my independent street check review, the importance of anti-bias and implicit bias training. And I'll start with the release of names. Much of the uproar over releasing officers' names can be attributed to a lack of education and a lack of communication. And let me just give you the context for this, right? So one of the big issues surrounding the Lopu death was the fact that the police officers who were being investigated as implicated in causing his death, their names were not released to the public, right? And there was this misperception on the part of stakeholders from the Black community that they were being treated preferentially from other people who were being investigated in other types of crimes, right? The reality, however, is that that was not the case, because, you know, if you're not charged, your name is not released, right? But this created a huge tension. And so members of the public demanded the release of officers' names for mainly 2 reasons. The first was that they felt that there was a double standard for police officers compared to civilians when an officer is being investigated but not charged. Of course, this is not true. Police generally do not release the names of individuals they have merely investigated. Rather, names become public when people are charged. That is exactly the same process that the SIU had been following. Now, in meeting after meeting, what I found was that once the misperception was cleared up, people felt much differently about the issue. They reacted with understanding rather than a sense of injustice. Education alleviated the problem. Lack of public education was a large part of the problem. Now, there's a caveat to that, right? Because there were still some groups that felt that the names should still be released, even if the police officers implicated but not charged, because the police, they have a greater responsibility and a role to play in the society. But I thought that, you know, you got to treat people, and the police officers, like I said earlier, they're ordinary citizens in uniform. And so, you know, you treat them like everybody else within that context. Now, if they're charged, it becomes a matter of public record. And so, like everyone else who is charged with a criminal offense, your name is released. The second reason members of the public demanded the release of names was because of a lack of communication from the SIU. This ties into the issue of releasing SIU reports. Members of the public weren't being told much about how the SIU conducted investigations or why it made its decision not to charge officers. So if they couldn't get that information, they at least wanted its name. So the context is this, right? So the SIU, as you've heard, is an independent investigative body that investigate police officers within the that have interactions with members of the public that results in death or serious bodily harm or allegations of sexual assaults. Now, if the police officer's charge is indicated, it's a matter of public record, right? And there's disclosure that is given by the investigative body to the accused officer. Now, when the police officer is investigated and not charged, then the director of the SIU, he creates a report that outlines the results of his investigation and the process through which he arrived at his decision. And unfortunately, prior to my review, that investigative report was never made public. All that they did was they submitted it to the Attorney General, and the Attorney General is supposed to review it. But in some contexts, and I think this came out then, the Attorney General didn't even read it, and it would be stored, right? And so that was an issue of major contention. And so you know, legislatively, they didn't have to release it to the public, but the police wanted these reports to be released to the public, and the public, aggrieved members of the public, they wanted these reports to be released to the public for transparency reasons. So the first thing that I was able to do is to say, look, you know what? The whole purpose of your existence is for independence and transparency. And if nobody knows what the process of this investigative report is, then, you know, it's defeating the ultimate purpose of your existence. And so everyone got that. And immediately the reports were released. And that was one of the interim things that we were able to do. So, you know, as indicated, in establishing the SIU, the legislative intent is to create an independent and transparent investigative body for the purpose of maintaining public confidence in the police and the justice system at large. And the dominant purpose of the legislative scheme was to avoid erosion of public's confidence if a police officer was involved in an incident which resulted in either a fatality or serious bodily harm or allegation of sexual assault. But this process did the opposite, did not foster public trust and confidence in the investigative process. So, you know, we were able to very quickly arrive at a mutually agreed upon understanding through communication and through interactions with the stakeholder groups. Now, lastly, the lack of proper education can also undermine the ways in which police interact with the public on a regular basis. And in my independent street checks review, I discussed the importance of anti-bias and bias training. And many studies have shown that the general population holds stereotypes. We all do. I can tell you that I do. I think each and every one of us in this room does. Many studies have shown that, people may have an implicit bias against others, which they're unaware of. The Supreme Court of Canada has recognized that a significant segment of our society holds overtly racist views. A much larger segment subconsciously operates on the basis of negative racial stereotypes. And I think this is propagated through, again, social media, through mass media, through television and movies. Police officers as members of the community are a reflection of the society in which they live. We're all products of our environment and subject to collective and individual biases, whether they're consciously or unconsciously held. Our conscious biases are much easier for us to deal with because we can be made aware of what those biases are. However, unconscious biases are much more difficult to deal with because individuals may not know they hold the biases and therefore cannot deal with them until they are aware of them. Although people may hold an unconscious bias, it does not mean that they identify with or agree with the bias or that they should be defined by that unconscious bias. In fact, consciously, the principles might be diametrically opposed to the unconscious bias they hold. As is the case with any large group of people, some police officers are also likely to be affected by unconscious stereotypically held views of people who may be ethnically, racially, or culturally different from themselves. These unconscious biases can exist despite police service efforts to cull individuals who hold such views during the recruitment and hiring processes. Even the most open-minded police officers may harbor an unconscious bias, which they're unaware of. As a result, anti-bias training should include recognition of implicit bias. Such training is already being provided to some police services in Ontario. And we talked about that, and now I can tell you that most services, they provide these type of training, recognizing the importance of this. And lastly, as indicated, the lesson that I learned was that the process was important. A fair process is sometimes more important to people than getting a desired outcome. People value being a part of the process for decisions that affect them and their communities. They also provide great value to decision makers. As indicated, when I began my first independent review in 2016, I set out what I thought was an ambitious consultation plan. Shortly after my consultations began, I realized that I would benefit from much more consultation than I originally thought I needed. In the end, I would go on to consult with over 1,500 people in roughly 150 meetings. Those consultations were invaluable to the review process. Policing and police oversight are very complex in our pluralistic and diverse society. Many of the people I met with contributed to my understanding of those complex issues. Many of the people I met with offered thoughtful solutions to the challenge and issues I faced. And because of that broad, thorough consultation, the insights I received were invaluable and were instrumental in the formulation of all of my recommendations. When my reports were released, many, if not all of the people I met with found out that I had not agreed with their position on one issue or another. But I believe because I had given them all a fair opportunity to be heard, they respected the legitimacy of the process and the ultimate recommendations in those situations. The process was as important as the outcome. So you may be wondering, why is this all important? It is important because we all live in a world that is constantly changing, and the world of policing is no different. Without adaptation to the change in pace of technology, demographics, migration, socioeconomic challenges, and the emergence of the new ways of people committing crime, then we risk falling behind and risk being less effective in addressing the needs of our communities. In conclusion, the police profession and the communities they serve are inextricably interconnected. This connection is understood in the Pelian principles of law enforcement, which recognize that the role of police is to maintain at all times a relationship with the public that gives reality to the historic tradition that the police are the public and the public are the police. At its core, modern policing is founded on public trust to be relevant, responsive, and meaningful in today's society. It's critical that the police keep the protection and promotion of the public trust as a guiding principle. And because of the day, a community that trusts the police confides in the police. A community that trusts the police helps the police. A community that trusts the police respects the police. And this in turn is the only way that the police can keep the communities that they serve safe. So those are just my thoughts. And I want to thank you very much again for your attention, for inviting me here, and thank you.
Thank you, Chief Justice Tulloch. First of all, I want to congratulate you on your recent appointment to as Chief Justice of Ontario. My question centers around this concept of community that we've been returning to throughout this lecture. Now, of course, in certain areas, the concept of community is a bit more homogenous. There can be common ground that's found a lot more easily, just smaller towns or areas that have a distinct identity. But on the other hand, in areas such as Toronto, there are specific communities within the city. Many people may be part of multiple communities at one time, or some people may just be commuters. And for them, the city of Toronto is just their community from 9 to 5 and nothing else. Regarding finding the common ground, are there any additional logistical challenges in multicultural and multinational cities such as Toronto and BC, Toronto and Vancouver compared to small scale communities? I was wondering what were your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I mean, I am very much aware of the pluralistic nature of an urban community like Toronto, right? And but I still think that we can find common ground. I think that each person, the majority of the people who lives in pluralistic, multicultural community, they still want to feel safe, right? And most of us, regardless of our micro communities, we still work hard, right? We still want our families to be safe. We still value the underlying principles that make the society the way it is. And so I think there is still room to find common ground. And I think that's the way I have looked at it. And you know, how do you view what is in the best interest of your own family as compared to the other people? I think that we all have what I would call an implicit social contract with each other, right? And based on that implicit social contract, we have rights and responsibilities. And, you know, if we're thinking of the social good of everyone, we will act accordingly. So.
Time for one more question over here. I'm sorry.
Thank you for taking the question. Of the 129 recommendations, those that have not been adopted, on the backdrop of the context you gave us at the beginning of your talk, both from the technology perspective that you highlighted, but also the emergence of different types of crimes that you've also noted, what do you think would be the best recommendations that haven't been adopted to go forward? What do you think is the priority right now? And if you could give us a little understanding of the path forward.
So I would say that all 129 of my recommendations are a priority, and I'm not gonna pick and choose. What I can tell you is that the 129 were narrowed down from probably 300 of them. So, you know, every one of them is urgent and they are a priority. And so that's my point.
Just want to take this opportunity to thank you, Chief Justice, for giving us a very thorough discussion of your reports. And we're very pleased that you accepted our invitation. I think that your words about the common ground and how they're on both sides really both agreeing on the need for accountability and transparency is something that resonates through our justice system, and something that I think can be applied to all levels of the justice system, not just policing, but is critical for policing. And I thank you, and ask everyone to join me in thanking the Chief Justice.